covered some of the more Old West stories.
Yes,
now we're looking at the Great Depression era now. And it's sort of fitting, really, with Springfield when you think about it, because the very first prisoner to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jeff City was from Greene County, sentenced in Springfield for stealing a pocket watch. 1836.
I have a pocket watch.
Me too.
I did not steal it.
Me either.
So hopefully when we go to the penitentiary, they won't keep me.
Exactly. Hopefully they'll let us back out.
Yes. And we here on Dark Ozarks, we cover a lot of folkloric issues. We cover a lot of paranormal. We conduct paranormal investigations. This typically we are dealing with crime. If we are dealing with the subject of crime, we're dealing with it from the aspect of almost periphery, because if it overlaps or relates particularly to a paranormal investigation. In this episode, while we may touch on hauntings, we're really focusing on the crime aspects as they relate to Southwest Missouri and to the Queen City in particular.
Yes. And I think in that regard, we can kind of jump off with Bonnie and Clyde.
Which is a great subject. Very iconic. And just in that regard, what do you think it was? Now, in the larger scope, during this era, and I think not unlike the Old West era, coming out of the Civil War, in this case, coming out of the Roaring '20s and Prohibition, we have situations in which larger authoritarian structures, as well as industrialist forces, were making major changes, social and economic changes to America as a whole, heavily impacting, oftentimes negatively impacting, the rural or the small town populations. And of course, in the case of the 1870s, you're looking at this time coming out of the devastation of the Civil War. In the 1930s, in particular, you're coming out of the high points of the 1920s, the Roaring '20s, but going directly into the economic devastation of the Great Depression, as well as the severe nationwide impact of things like the Dust Bowl, the droughts, severe winters during the 1930s, severe, for goodness sakes, locusts, grasshopper plagues, etc. And we're looking at this time when, in both cases, some of the most vulnerable populations were being heavily impacted, and industry, the railroads, the banks, became targets by the common people. Most common people could not respond. Some did. Jesse James, in the first iteration, as well as many others. And then obviously in the 30s, we see a number of quote unquote outlaws, gangsters, certainly strong elements of organized crime. Bonnie and Clyde. So we've established that this dynamic was going on. Bonnie and Clyde really seem to particularly capture the imagination of the American public.
They did. It's kind of a backward story in a way, in that they didn't so much in the beginning. They had their supporters, they had those that helped them, but once their sort of the iconic photos were found at the hideout in Joplin, Missouri, and were put out in APB bulletins and wanted posters and so forth, they got this image of they really were these brutal gangsters and these murderers because they had candid shots. They were holding guns and so forth, and some of them you can tell they're joking around when they're doing it with each other, but it painted this picture of violence. And so they weren't seen as a Robin Hood characters yet. I think that really came with their killing, and it was so brutal. And then it started turning into this romance and this this love story. And then, of course, over time, that legend grew and was sort of codified in the movie with Warren Beatty.
Yes, and Faye Dunaway, which is and a fantastic Foggy Mountain Breakdown soundtrack.
Yes. And was it realistic? No. For one thing, they did not look those parts. The real Bonnie and Clyde. They were not glamorous. They were not movie star, good-looking people, that kind of thing. But the movie helped build that legend, and it's continued.
It has. I think it is an incredibly powerful motif, and something that perhaps just as a genre or as a motif, there is that Robin Hood element, but there's also even though it's very much a misnomer, the idea of freedom against authority, the idea that somehow you're going to do this and you're going to get away.
Right. And that part of it kind of applied there, because not so much the Robin Hood, robbing from the rich, giving to the poor with Bonnie and Clyde. That did apply with Pretty Boy Floyd, that we'll get into later, but not Bonnie and Clyde. But I think for a lot of people, a lot of people don't realize the other part of what was going on societally was because of the economic crisis, because of everything going on. There were very few jobs, lots of foreclosures, people losing their homes, losing their farms. And so a lot of just social instability and resentment.
Yes.
And resentment at the circumstances, and the target of the resentment tended to go towards the banks and the people who held money at that time. And so there was a feeling for some people that, the big guy got it stuck to him, and good for them.
Mm-hmm. And when you begin to understand the kind of economic desperation that many people found themselves in,
Mm-hmm.
it is, while not legal, it is understandable.
It is. Certainly, you have to look at all of these situations in the context of the moment that it happened in to really understand them. But Springfield was pivotal in this story arc for Bonnie and Clyde, because as far as we can tell, as far as is known, the first time that they ever kidnapped a police officer, which they ended up doing a number of times, but the first time it happened in Springfield.
Yes.
On St. Louis, in front of the Shrine Mosque.
Yes.
Which, by the way, pivoting for a second, is haunted, and I've done an investigation there years ago.
It's an amazing structure with with a phenomenal history. I love the way that its architecture dominates downtown. It's incredibly evocative, and of course, even just dealing with some of the history of the of the Shrine Mosque, has had an enormous number of events, some of great significance, and individuals having passed through those spaces, those halls,
Yes,
by itself is amazing.
it really is. And I guess just to insert, that slide when we talk about paranormal, I did have an experience there during the investigation. This was about 10 years ago, and encountered apparition of what was a small boy, and who said his name was Tommy. It appeared to predate the Shrine Mosque, though, because he he was dressed in earlier period clothing. I'd say early to mid 1800s.
Wow. Which, of course, there was a lot of things going on in that section of Springfield at that time.
Exactly. So no other details that I know of, and I don't know, a historical context of who it would be, but that was a personal experience.
Yes. I want to dig into that for just a moment.
Okay.
How did the apparition come about?
We were doing an investigation, and we were actually upstairs in the catwalks, and excuse me. Milo is getting involved here.
And for folks who don't know, Dark Ozarks and State of the Ozarks has now several mascots.
Yes.
Ghost hunting dogs. I have Sky, the American Basset, and from Sugar Camp Farms. And you all recently acquired a wonderful new addition to the family. His name is Milo, and he was actually a rescue.
He was a rescue, but appears to be predominantly American foxhound. And
Yes.
And does seem to take notice of activities. So
I'm excited. Both of our puppies do seem to be tuned in to their environment, in some cases more tuned in than we're physically able to be as human beings.
Yep.
And they're both very, very sweet. I love Milo immensely.
Oh, and I love Sky. So
so for behind the scenes, and certainly for upcoming Facebook subscribers, there's a really good chance that you will be seeing Milo and Sky in action on investigations.
Definitely. So what did you want to delve into further on that?
Well, the things that really jump out to me, if you are a fan of the film, if you've seen the Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway film with the amazing banjo soundtrack, which probably did as much to popularize American bluegrass as it did to further the mystique of Bonnie and Clyde.
True.
That, and for the record, the first time that I watched the film, pop culture reference, the Marshall, is it Marshall or the Ranger?
He's a Texas Ranger.
Texas Ranger. The Texas Ranger is played by Denver Pyle, of Dukes of Hazzard fame. For those who are familiar with Dukes of Hazzard, it's Uncle Jesse.
Yeah. And on the Andy Griffith Show.
Yes. Briscoe Darlin on the Andy Griffith Show. And I grew up with Dukes of Hazzard. And so the first time that I watched Bonnie and Clyde, it is designed. They are presented as, I think it would be fair to say they are presented as glamorous anti-heroes.
Yes.
And they are, within the context of the film, they are. Yeah. And of course, it's Warren Beatty and it's Faye Dunaway. So they are. And at the same time, first, I wasn't terribly old the first time I watched it. And about halfway through, I'm going, they made fun of Uncle Jesse. They need to pay for that.
And they did in the end, in reality.
Yes, they did. So that was my first experience, but I have the film on DVD. I think it's amazing. Highly recommend that people watch it. That said, you can watch the entire film and have very little, if any, understanding that so much that was pivotal in their crime spree took place in the Ozarks and in Southwest Missouri. And the fact that three iconic moments in their career of crime. First, Springfield, in direct proximity to the Shrine Mosque. Second, a long distance getaway involving a brief kidnapping that intersected with Reed Spring. And the Reed Springs Junction, which I just drove through like a couple of weeks ago, and realized, based on the information, that the police barricade was set up where the old viaduct is, where the train goes through, which is the same tracks that run through Hollister. It's all getting very close to home at this point. And they nabbed a gentleman and held him hostage until they got to Burrillville, because he could point the back roads over toward Cape Fear, and interesting intersection of crime and folkloric element and paranormal as well. The evidence is strong evidence is that they took the road out past Dead Man's Pond, or the Yoakum Pond.
Oh, really?
So
interesting.
Trying to take the back roads, avoid the cops at the Reed Spring Junction, and get over to what is now West 76, and then to get around and then get from there to Berryville. And of course, Berryville, Arkansas, cross the state line. So, and one story involving them, of course, they're driving super fast. They slam on the brakes, and there's I think a couple of teenage girls who were, had just crossed the old road, and they're like, "Do you know how to get to, Berryville, the back way, etc.?" And the girls just faked ignorance and said, "No, we have no idea." And then later figured that they'd probably saved themselves from a temporary kidnapping, because if they had said, "Yes, we know what the direction or know how to get there," they probably would have forced them into the car. And so that story, and just the fact that, of course, dealing with the same aspects. Interestingly enough, I think for those of us who did grow up with Dukes of Hazzard, the idea of high speed cars, in this case V8 Fords, which seemed to be Clyde Barrow's vehicle of choice for getaways, and the fact that you could ostensibly get away if you had a fast enough horse. In this case, a V8,
it's true.
Ford, which is a concept that we really struggle with today.
Yeah. Goodness. Part of that is because we have a harder time outrunning technology. Yes.
And the network of communication that brings us closer together.
And your pursuits are not going to stop at the state line and things like that, which happened then. And
Yes.
then, actually other stories with Bonnie and Clyde and the Ozarks include, of course, the shootout at the Joplin hideout, which is still there, and I've investigated. And then actually Officer Purcell being the first officer being kidnapped by them in Springfield, the last officers they took hostage were actually in Commerce, Oklahoma, which is just across the state line and technically still in the Ozarks.
Yes.
And in fact, that happened after the shootout at the hideout, and all of their photos were released. And one notable thing that happened during that trip was that Bonnie kept complaining to the officers that she was not a gun moll and she did
Right.
not smoke cigarettes, that it was just a joke photo.
Yes. Yeah. There's something I want to dig into a little bit. I was having a conversation a few weeks ago actually about this, and the question came up, why couldn't, for example, law enforcement in one county, say in Missouri, just telephone law enforcement in, say, an Oklahoma county, and have law enforcement waiting for them as they cross the state line? What was the dynamic there that allowed people to cross state lines at that point?
Well, to do that, you technically then you would need a federal crime. You need federal involvement, and there was just less coordination, and so it was just viewed more independently. What happens here happens here, what happens there happens there. And yeah, the systems were not plugged into each other the way they are now. That was a lot of it. And not as much cooperation either.
Right. And that, so just jumping forward, spoiler alert, Bonnie and Clyde did not make it to Mexico.
No, they and that's the thing I've always said, is they should have just gone to Mexico instead of going to Louisiana, and instead of trying to turn themselves in. And that maybe that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that they tried to turn themselves in at the end, and the Texas Rangers pretty well made sure that didn't happen, which does kind of tie back into the events in the movie that you described, which are based on events that happened in the general area around Joplin, Missouri. So
yes, and it's interesting to note, while Bonnie and Clyde may be certainly two of the most well-known actors in this era, they were by no means the only. There were many, many individuals who were embarking upon their life of crime, and sometimes to a grand scale.
Yes, and I think let's talk just a little bit about the kidnapping of Officer Purcell.
Yes.
It's easy to look at it sort of in hindsight. When this took place, this was several months before the shootout in Joplin and the photos coming out.
Right. It was January 26, 1933.
Right. And the events in Joplin at the hideout were in April. So roughly 3 months. And so they were relatively unknown in this area. They hadn't made a big name for themselves yet. And certainly were not on wanted posters everywhere. But they were looking, they were in a car from out of state. They were looking for another car to steal, because apparently they were having some trouble with this one. And so they spotted a car that was parked in front of the Shrine Mosque with, I think, Washington state plates on it. And so they're looking it over enough that Officer Purcell, he was a motorcycle officer, noticed that they were paying too much attention, basically. So he started following them and then pulled them over. And when he got off his motorcycle to walk up to the driver's door, the door opens and Clyde Barrow comes out with a sawed-off shotgun.
That's effective.
And so they kidnap him, put him in the back seat. Bonnie's in the back seat with him. Another gang member was in the front seat, and he said that there were bags of guns on the floor, that basically his feet were on rifles and guns, and there were bags of money. I mean, it almost looks like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. And they were looking, they were discussing directions and how to get out of town. And it was pretty apparent that they weren't as familiar with Springfield. And so he ends up giving them directions. And they end up going through Bolivar, through Greenfield, and actually ultimately they end up just north of Joplin, Missouri, and let him out at Stone's Corner, which you may be familiar with as the roundabout.
Oh my God.
Going to the farm. So yes. Literally they let him out about 2 miles from our family farm.
Yes.
And he had to walk to the general store to call and then he called the police department in Joplin, who then called Springfield. Yeah. Clyde also relieved him of his pistols. He had 2 custom-made Russian pistols with pearl grips, and that had cost quite a bit of money. Mm-hmm. And his accounts, contemporaneous, were less flamboyant. Over time, his accounts became more flamboyant and less charitable, particularly towards Bonnie, which I find amusing. And then once the photos were found and identified, he identified them as his captors. And also one of the photos that they found, Clyde Barrow is holding Officer Purcell's gun. And it's identified, it was custom enough that it was identifiable in the photo. So pretty well sealed it that yes, they are the ones who kidnapped him.
Yes, and essentially county coup.
Yeah.
Realistically, one of the points Purcell, it being interviewed, described Clyde, quote, as a dark-faced desperado, Bonnie as, quote, not the least bit beautiful, and their sidekick as, quote, a chunky thug.
Yeah. Officer Purcell was not impressed, apparently.
Well, they got the buster better of him.
Exactly.
And
and a long ride and a long ride back. So
and a lot of embarrassment, realistically.
yeah. But again, this was, not unknown, but sort of the beginning of some of these kinds of kidnappings. There certainly had already been bank robberies with the Great Depression, but sort of these on the road outlaws, kidnapping officers and so forth, that seemed to pick up more in the early 30s. And so again, it's a situation people, you didn't expect that.
No. And it I think that culturally there's a bit of a dichotomy, pre-industrialization, essentially pre-urban industrialization, that so much of America, there were places that were very dangerous. There were places that had a lot of crime. There were places that you had to be ready for these types of things. But a great deal of rural America was inexpressibly bucolic. It was a place where the outside world largely did not intrude in the sense of crime. My family members, my previous generations in rural southern Iowa did not lock their doors. They did not lock their cars.
Same, with my relatives in Kansas
and fast forward to the 80s for us, we did.
Yeah.
But there's simply the understanding, and I grew up with the understanding that it didn't used to be like this. And so I think that within the gangster era, the sort of Depression era criminal concept also hit home in unique ways to the public for those reasons as well.
That's true. And it really did make an impression when you had outlaws that were that bold, that gave rise to the legend because someone was that bold. I think in counterpoint to Bonnie and Clyde, who by all accounts they were not helping other people out. There were, over time, there were those that did give them assistance and let them fly under the radar in certain places, usually places that they had a connection with previously, family and so forth. Flip side is Pretty Boy Floyd, who really, ironically, has even more contact with the Ozarks overall in some ways, because he grew up around the Cookson Hills area in Oklahoma, which is in the Oklahoma Ozarks, and he really did sort of pursue that Robin Hood outlaw pattern that, say, Jesse James did, the legends of helping out, the widow that's about to lose her farm, the story about the James brothers, things like that. And Pretty Boy Floyd did the same thing. He often would give money to people in need. He would give money to entire towns to help feed them through the winter, things like that. So that, to be honest, in that area, he was considered a hero during this time period that people were starving.
Yes. And I think that really highlights something we've largely within a comparatively speaking, highly prosperous generation
Mm-hmm.
that has had comparatively little social upheaval
Exactly.
that 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 we've enjoyed. That it again is difficult for many to wrap their heads around the dynamics of what was going on at that time, and we have a very inured idea of larger industry, larger finance, larger authoritarian structures and powers that be. We simply assume, and in past several generations, it's been an effective or a commonplace assumption carried out by common sense that these structures have all of our best interests at heart, and so to go against one is to be outside the pale.
Yes.
And something that we see with the particularly financial upheaval, that the devastation, the economic devastation, the families starving in during the Dust Bowl, etc., were some of the eggs that just had to be broken in order to weather through these processes. That being I think a rationale, and consequently, suddenly the individuals like Pretty Boy Floyd were the benevolent, not authority, but the benevolent person in charge.
Exactly. And another thing that is a little different in his case than, say, Bonnie and Clyde is he actually had a family,
Yes.
including a young son, and really ended up getting into crime because he was in that kind of situation himself in the 20s, trying to work and support his family and really trying to go the honest way, and nothing working, and ended up getting into robbery and so forth, and then ending up at the Missouri State Penitentiary. And some people say, why are we talking about this and the Ozarks and Oklahoma about Springfield? Well, while he was in prison, he met someone and became friends with the Young Brothers. And particularly Harry, the youngest brother. And the Young Brothers are definitely a Springfield story, with Pretty Boy Floyd playing a role in one way or another.
Yeah.
And so I think, but having sort of that background on him, I think is interesting and helpful. Now, by the same token, he killed at least 10 men. Right. And ironically, he didn't put notches on a gun. He put notches on a pocket watch.
We're back to the pocket watch.
And but then we look at the Young Brothers, and they are definitely it seems to be a product of the upheaval and the economic instability that was going on. Let's see. Agreed.
Now, something that is of interest to me is that many of these characters made their way into folk song.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty Boy Floyd has his own folk song.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually in the Max Hunter library archive, which I think is interesting. It's pretty accurate.
It is.
There's that aspect. There something that really struck me just momentarily out of the reports. Obviously, very two different men, but both received an education in how to become much better criminals through their time at the penitentiary.
Yes.
And that's Billy Cook.
That is Billy Cook. That's a story for another day.
It is. But I just that connection with Jeff City really stood out in that regard. There's also really interesting that to me, I think this has a direct tie with Springfield, and we'll come back to the primary tie with Springfield, but the temporary kidnapping of Sheriff Jack Killingsworth from Bolivar.
Yes. And I don't know whether we want to touch on that now or after the Young Brothers, because it happens later in time, actually.
Right. So let's jump over to the Young Brothers, and then we'll come back.
Okay. Now the Young Brothers, there were a number of children, but the brothers that tended to have run-ins with the law were Paul, Harry, and Jennings, and got into trouble through the 1920s, just like pre-Boy Floyd. And all three of them served terms at Missouri State Penitentiary. Yes. For theft, burglary, things like that. Jennings and Paul also served terms at Leavenworth. And as a result, local law enforcement in the Springfield area, they knew them. And that kind of plays into what happened too. The fact that they knew them as well as they did, I think, ended up being a disadvantage for the officers because they thought they could handle the situation easier.
Do you think that law enforcement at that era, not being more casual, but being more, for lack of a better word, hometown?
I think in a to a degree, but in this situation, the evidence seemed to point to they thought that they thought that they could talk to the boys. They had not killed people before. They had not, shot at people. They primarily, small time robbery, stealing cars, things like that. So to be honest, I just don't think they thought that they were going to walk into a shootout.
Which, however, they did.
They did, which also comes into play of whether or not the brothers were the ones who, initially started the shootout, and that leads to, questions that linger to this day. But and really, even the situation that led to the massacre started out with a stolen car. It was not, a bank robbery. It was not taking someone, hostage, that kind of thing. Basically, one of the brothers had been involved. Now, I take that back. One of the brothers had been involved in a shooting with a Republic officer a couple years earlier. And, but even at that, they did not view them as a big risk for that. Basically, they had been laying low because of the shooting for a couple of years, but would come into town every so often. And the family farm was at Brookline, just south of town, basically.
Right. And my understanding is Brookline is now part of Republic.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, Republic has extended out basically,
Okay.
but and their father had died during the 1920s. Their father was very well respected. When they first started getting into trouble, they would, he would bail them out, and until they end up going to prison. And so basically December 30th of 1931, the brothers end up in town trying to sell a stolen car. And they weren't having much luck at it. And so they ended up enlisting a couple of their sisters to help them. And let's see. And that was Lorena and Vanita. Harry and Jennings were the two brothers that ended up with the massacre. And basically, car dealers starts getting wise that this car may be stolen, it's not really theirs. And so the sisters end up admitting that the brothers had put them up to it after the dealer had called the police. Yes. And so the police go out and they pick up their mother, Willie. Their father had passed away by this point. And so they question her. And finally, they figure out that the brothers are at the farmhouse. But they really didn't make a plan of action when they went. They basically just got in cars. There's 10 officers. And they just go out there, and they knock on the door. There's no answer. And then they are trying to decide what to do. Now, one of the officers walks around to the back door. And he knew the boys, he knew the family personally. And I think that was, again, part of the problem, is he knew everybody. And so he thought they would just listen to him. And basically, the story went, what they could piece together, that he probably did not even get words out when he got to the back door, and there was a gunfire and he gets shot. And so there's a shootout, and within just minutes you have 6 officers dead, 3 wounded, I believe. And the brothers escape out the back door. Now, a lot of people conjectured at the time, and still do, that the brothers were not alone, that Pretty Boy Floyd was in the house with them. And he would come and visit the family. And some people, might say, well, why Springfield or whatever? Because he was from Oklahoma. But Ricchetti, who he sometimes would work with, and comes into play with the kidnapping of the sheriff later on, lived in Bolivar. And so they often would lay low in Bolivar or Springfield at the Young farm. And also I've heard tales that there was a house at Humansville that they would lay low at.
Very interesting.
So it would not be unusual for him to be in the area. And so there's a lot of conjecture that the reason there was shooting started and the officers were ambushed was that it was really Pretty Boy Floyd and not the brothers who started it. But the long and short of it is the brothers get away. And then about 3 days later, they get word they think they're heading to Texas. There's connections in Houston, and they actually find them 3 days later, January 5th, 1932, at a house in Houston, and it's been described as the largest manhunt in Texas history, actually, trying to track them down. And they were there under assumed names, and the police raided the house, and they say when they went in, they found the brothers dead, and that it appeared to be a murder-suicide.
Yes.
Now, it is interesting that all of the records from the Houston Police Department on the manhunt and the crime scene just disappeared shortly afterwards.
That is extremely interesting. So at the end of the day, we simply don't know. What we do know is that the massacre in Brookline was indeed a massacre, especially in regards to the history of American law enforcement.
It was the largest loss of law enforcement in a single incident up into 9/11.
Yes, which of course explains the scope of the manhunt.
Yes.
And it could explain the ultimately unknown events in Houston.
Very true. You just don't know. And people who knew the brothers said that, you know, they were surprised that it would be a murder-suicide. And so, you know, of course, there was conjecture that maybe the police just, you know, killed them without warning and said that. And when the records disappeared, that didn't help, you know, rumors. But it's hard to know. Now, sort of the aftermath of this is kind of strange too. The brothers make out the back door and get away. Crowd gathers, and they start shooting up the house, and they want to burn the house down.
That's a contaminated crime scene.
Well, and the officers that were there were saying that some of the crowd actually drug a mattress out on the front porch and set it on fire. And officers had to stomp the fire out. So basically, the crowd, there's a crowd of about 50 people, basically destroyed the house. So then the Springfield police, they release the mother and the sisters, and they come home and their house is pretty well destroyed. And interestingly, then between that time and him being killed a little over a year later, Pretty Boy Floyd would come through town regularly, and he basically gave the mother and sisters money, and supported them.
That is fascinating. And again, it explains, well, one of the things that we always come back to with Dark Ozarks is sometimes there are no easy answers. This is one of those cases, because you have individuals that you want to put in a box and say and label the box, and then their activities prevent you from fully doing that.
Yeah, which also goes to say, you know, that even legends and even very notorious individuals and stories are not one-dimensional.
No. And in continuing with Pretty Boy Floyd, and just sort of coming off of this, we have this June 16th, 1933 case of the kidnapping of Sheriff Jack Killingsworth. And there's a pretty substantive record of this experience that was collected from Bernice Killingsworth, Jack's at the time widow. But it's, to me, it's fascinating. And for those who are familiar with these locations here in Southwest Missouri, Highway 13, Bolivar, Springfield, these are hometowns. These are local places. The connection with Humansville, I find particularly fascinating.
Yeah. And I've heard that on multiple occasions and read accounts that Ricchetti, who was with Pretty Boy Floyd during the kidnapping, that he had relatives at Humansville, and that's where they would lay low.
That would, again, make sense. I have to step away for just a few seconds.
Okay.
But coming into this story, if you could just share, we both reviewed this story, some of the details of this kidnapping. It's not that dissimilar from the Purcell case in terms of a more than interesting day for this particular member of law enforcement.
Exactly. And ultimately there is a Springfield connection before it's all over with, a direct Springfield connection. But yeah, this is June 16th, 1933. Jack Killingsworth is the sheriff of Polk County, and he's taken hostage at gunpoint from a garage on West Broadway by Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti. And Ricchetti would work with Pretty Boy Floyd at different times. Basically, they were traveling. They had been in the outlaws. Floyd and Ricchetti had been in Springfield, so they were actually coming from Springfield when the car that they had stolen in Oklahoma gave out. So they are at a garage that Ricchetti's brother works at, his brother Joe. And then the sheriff walks in, and the sheriff just happened to walk in, but they recognized each other. The sheriff knew Ricchetti, knew Floyd. Floyd's picture had been in the newspapers. He, had wanted posters, etc. And then he knew Ricchetti because Ricchetti had lived in Bolivar. And so they personally knew each other. So that's an interesting thing that wasn't part of the Bonnie and Clyde story. But the sheriff knew that they were wanted. But they had lots of guns on them. Ricchetti was drunk and continuing to drink. And interestingly, during this account, the sheriff says that Pretty Boy Floyd is the one who was reasonable and basically kept trying to keep Ricchetti from killing him.
I found that aspect to be particularly interesting.
Me too, because he had killed a number of people, including law enforcement. But my guess is he looked at there was no reason to kill him. Is kind of the way I figure, is that he decided that. Plus, they say that, they were wanting to get out of town. So they basically take Ricchetti's brother's car, and it's a new car. And the sheriff and Pretty Boy Floyd start talking about their kids, basically.
Yes.
And on reflection, the sheriff thinks that is probably what kept him alive, is that kind of connection they ended up making. And ultimately, Ricchetti kept saying he wanted to kill the sheriff, and they basically end up outside of Clinton, Missouri, at Deepwater, trying to change cars again. And so they end up making the sheriff stop a car, and they take that car and the driver, his name was Griffith, they take him hostage, and basically they end up going to Kansas City.
Right.
And by this account, that the sheriff, is the one who said, well, I know how to get Kansas City from here. And so it's not even clear that they intended to go to Kansas City. They get to Kansas City and they let them out in Lee's Summit. Pretty Boy Floyd gives them money and tells them to have dinner and then take the car and go home, which they do.
Yes.
The next morning, about 7 a.m., the Kansas City massacre occurs.
Yes, it does.
And because Sheriff Killingsworth reports this incident, and they know that he doesn't. He's pretty rambunctious tonight.
Well, I think he's wanting to come in here. Like,
oh, I know. That's why he wants, but he was pretty rambunctious earlier. So they're able to verify that Pretty Boy Floyd was in Kansas City pretty much the day it happened, or at least the night before.
Which implicates him in the massacre.
Implicates him. And he ends up sending a letter to the investigators in Kansas City saying, I didn't do it. And that letter is postmarked from Springfield. So he had been back in Springfield.
So two questions.
Uh-huh.
Just in terms of conjecture. One, Springfield is a long way from state lines.
Yeah.
What do you think is the appeal of Springfield as a hub for a variety of these incidents?
Route 66, for one thing, just getting from one place to another. A lot of these, Bonnie and Clyde, Pretty Boy Floyd, a lot of their bank robberies happened in Oklahoma. So you get away from there, or you're somewhere and you travel to it. Pretty Boy Floyd had also operated out of Ohio a lot earlier in his criminal career. So I think he would go through there and he'd go home to Oklahoma. And so you'd be passing through.
That makes sense.
And so I think that's the case in a lot of those situations of what was going on. So what was happening at the same time, that basically a car breaks down, so they need another car. They stop in Bolivar, end up in Kansas City, and at the same time the Kansas City massacre happens. And the Kansas City massacre was a situation where a low-level mobster, Joey Nash, had escaped from prison, and they had caught up with him. The U.S. Marshals had caught up with him and arrested him in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and were taking him to Leavenworth. And his wife and a gangster out of Minnesota, Vern Miller, decided we're going to break him out. And So they had actually met in Joplin, Missouri, with Harold Duffy Farmer, who ran a large safe house for gangsters, for the mob in Joplin, to plan the Kansas City Massacre. And originally it was going to happen in Joplin, and then they changed it to happen at Union Station in Kansas City.
That real quickly, that safe house in Joplin, historically, do we know where it is located? Do folks know where it was located, or is that
They're very, I've heard various accounts of where it was, but I don't know definite. I do not know definite address. There is also I have also heard from someone actually not long ago that her father, that she was an elderly woman in her early 80s, and that her father and mother lived in an apartment in Joplin during this time period, and that at one point sort of a dangerous looking man came to their door knocking and asking for Pretty Boy Floyd, saying that he had lived at that apartment at one point. Now that I don't know, but that was the story handed down in her family. She said that was actually before she was, a little before she was born.
Which is a not unsettling experience.
Exactly. And that's how she said her father described it. It was pretty unsettling to answer that door and get that kind of statement, you know. So, you know, these guys, they got around a lot. So, but, and there actually is a legend in this area that Pretty Boy Floyd was at the meeting planning the Kansas City Massacre. But the fact that this was happening over just, 2 or 3 days from the time they caught Jelly Nash to the massacre, and we know that Pretty Boy Floyd was in Springfield and in Bolivar, it does make you wonder, was he really at that meeting or not? But there's a legend that supposedly he was, and that he mailed a postcard to the Joplin Police Department from Joplin saying "you missed me" and signing it. That's not been confirmed by the police department or anything, and I tend to think it is more legend. And that may have been embellished by Harold Farmer over time, because he ended up doing time in Alcatraz for planning the massacre, and he tried to name the Barker Karpus gang, the Ma Barker boys, as the shooters. And law enforcement approval determined they knew that they were not in the area. They couldn't have been in the area. Although Karpus and Pretty Boy Floyd, actually, they knew each other, and I think had spent time in prison together. So, all of these guys had some connections.
Which comes back to the question in this regard with Pretty Boy Floyd. Is in the immediate area. He's transitioning Springfield to Bolivar to Kansas City. The Kansas City Massacre takes place. The shooter is described by an eyewitness, and the description is similar to Pretty Boy Floyd. But
it is similar, but then witnesses also identify the shooters as Vern Miller and his partner.
Yes, with who could also have fit that description.
Yeah.
Now, it is likely fair to say that for a variety of reasons, Floyd is top of the list.
He was at that time, and certainly J. Hoover pushed him being the top of the list, and actually used the Kansas City Massacre as a tool, PR tool, to gain more authority from Congress for the FBI. Now, for Boy Floyd, ironically, maintained to the end that he was not involved. He was not the shooter.
Yes.
And this gets a little interesting, actually, when they do catch him a year later in Ohio. And the FBI is there, and actually Purvis is there, and Purvis is the agent that Elliot Ness and the Untouchables is based on. He was there. They actually, there's a shootout. The officer who shot Pretty Boy Floyd later said that Purvis ordered another agent to kill Pretty Boy Floyd because they shot him. They put him under an apple tree. Purvis said, I want to ask him questions. And he asked him about whether or not he was involved with the Kansas City Massacre. Floyd denies it. And later, the officer said, Smith says that Purvis ordered another agent to shoot him, to fire into him, to get him to talk. And the guy empties a submachine gun into Floyd's body, which of course kills him. And later the officer Smith asked, well, do you think the FBI covered this up? And he said yes, because they didn't want people to know that he died that way.
It does get interesting and messy in a great big hurry.
Yes, it does.
That. Oh, so question. Do you believe, based on the evidence currently at hand, that Pretty Boy Floyd was involved in the Kansas City Massacre?
I think it's unlikely. I think it's fairly unlikely.
It seems that way to me as also.
Well, and he worked alone mainly. And if Nash had been a personal friend of his, maybe. But Nash was in the mob, and it seems more likely that someone like Vern Miller would have done it because of the mob connection. And actually, later on, after all of this, there was a lot of credible information that the Chicago outfit basically, ordered Vern Miller, go back home and stay out of trouble, because they believed that he was the one that had done this and basically put a lot of heat on people. So it's hard to know for sure, but I tend to think he didn't have anything to do with that. I do wonder whether or not he was at the Young family farm, though, in Brookline.
Yes. And that brings up another question, since I'm just feeling like conjecturing. What would be the possibility that Adam Rachetti was also at the Brookline farm?
It's possible, because they did work together at times, but not always. So, and I don't know offhand if anyone knows where Rachetti was at that particular day. If he was there, that's certainly, I mean, he was known to be less predictable and more volatile. So that's certain. I could see that happening.
I can as well. If Rachetti could be placed in Brookline,
Mm-hmm.
at the Young Brothers Massacre, or if his whereabouts could be placed somewhere near Springfield immediately prior or immediately following, but not accounted for on the day
Right.
It would be
Now,
very, very
it
interesting.
it is pretty well said that no one can really account for where Floyd was on that day. So that is one reason that people tend to think that he might have been there and been the initial shooter anyway.
Yes, it would be to me fascinating if, again, I'm basing this off of the first person account of Killingsworth
Mm-hmm.
and his interaction with both Floyd and Ricchetti.
Mm-hmm.
That Ricchetti seems to be much more unstable.
Yes, and well, and that seems to be, accounts at different points in time, not just with these events with Ricchetti. And when they actually caught Ricchetti shortly before Pretty Boy Floyd, they were not together at that time, and he denied that they were there too, as well, for the massacre in Kansas City.
Yeah. It does get messy. It's
It
messy
does.
in a big hurry, and leaving a lot of unanswered questions. There simply are a large number of unanswered questions involving so many facets of these stories.
They really are, but it does. But those questions are part of the reason why, as you said, a lot of these people ended up with folk songs written about them.
Yes, it does. It does. And as bloody and as terrible as it was, it created an era.
It really did. But sort of the flip side of that is it is really surprising, though, that the Young Brothers are so unknown, relatively speaking.
I think that's fair. That's very fair, especially considering the casualty count.
Yes,
Outside of Republic, Missouri.
Exactly. And so, that part is surprising because, I mean, you had number of officers killed and shot almost equaling the number that Pretty Boy Floyd shot in his career, or Clyde Barrow shot in his career, all right, in 6 minutes.
Yeah. The actual location, my assumption is it's private property.
It is private property. Yeah.
So for those who are listening, it's private property, so don't go there.
Yes, and we do ask you to respect that. But the house is still there, repaired over time. So, but not owned by the family anymore.
Very
before we
yes.
Before we turn to a couple other true crime cases, why don't we just talk about maybe one of the most infamous hauntings of Springfield?
Which one would you like to cover?
Pythian Castle.
Of course, we get a lot of questions about Pythian Castle.
We do.
You and I both been there separately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
State of the Ozarks has published an article on the Pythian Castle back in 2015, I believe. And it's a beautiful location, and it is open for tours. It
is, and ghost tours specifically.
Which is how I found out about it. And it looks like a castle.
Mhm.
And at the time that it was constructed, it was opened in 1913 by the Fraternal Order of the Pythian Knights.
Mhm.
And it was at the time on the extreme northeast corner of the Springfield metropolitan area, and was really considered to be a huge step in development of Springfield, which apparently worked.
Mhm.
The Springfield, the city fathers, quote unquote, of Springfield were very anxious for the honor of getting a Pythian castle,
Mhm.
and there were a number of other cities that were vying for this facility, and so it was definitely a positive coup for Springfield, and involved actually building with the promise that if the Pythian castle was constructed in Springfield, that they would build the streetcar line all the way out
Yeah.
at the time, and that even though it looks very Gothic, and it is constructed of Carthage limestone,
Mhm.
it was opened in 1913, so relatively speaking, it is somewhat new. I use that new in quotes. It's newer than
109
it
years old.
appears. It looks like a Gothic castle or
It does.
manor. And for people who might not be familiar with the Knights of Pythias, especially during that time, it was to a degree a fraternal order that also functioned as family insurance if the knight, the male member of the family who was a member of the fraternal order, if he were to die, that his widow and or orphans would have the safeguard of a home. They could go to one of the Pythian castles. There were a number of them located across North America, and seek refuge, essentially, where widows and orphans would be cared for. Their financial needs would be met, and their personal needs, food, shelter, that sort of thing, until they could take care of themselves, or until they passed away of old age in the case of a widow. But also that otherwise destitute knights, members of the fraternal order, could also retire there. So it was one part. It was definitely an element of the social services of that era, and it was half retirement home, half orphanage.
Yes, I think for a lot of people, this is pre-Social Security days, things like that, that most people never had a pension or retirement. And so if something drastic happened to the family, you often had people who just simply could not support themselves.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it was a means to deal with those situations. And when it was built, it was basically out by itself and had a big buffer area around it. And whereas today it's pretty well in the middle of town, but
it is, and unfortunately easy to overlook just based on this location.
right, where everything else around it is, it's sort of, if you don't know how to get there, you don't get there type thing.
But once you're there, you're there.
Oh yeah, it's hard to miss once you realize it. And then it took a bit of a turn during World War II.
Yes, and I think that is particularly fascinating at the beginning of the buildup of the war effort. It was a lot of troops were transitioned through the space, and one of the main sort of public areas was opened up as a sort of USO dance hall for young servicemen and the young ladies of Springfield to enjoy one another's company.
Mhm.
And then it, as part of the U.S. military requisitioning, it became a small POW prison,
Yes.
and a number of Nazi POWs were housed in the basement, and that's that sounds bad, but the basement is massive.
Yes, yes, and not necessarily what people would think, maybe a dungeon or something like that. It's not that.
No, and one Japanese prisoner of war, which I found very extremely evocative. The reports of the prisoners were that the European prisoners of war tended to be very antagonistic and very, very difficult to interact with. The one Japanese member of the POW, and we don't currently know his name or what happened to him, other than that at the end of the war he returned to Japan, but that he was very, that the prison guards enjoyed working with him, and one of his only notable request was paintbrushes and paint, and he painted a beautiful mural on his prison wall, which is still there today.
Yes. Yes. And there, I don't know, there's just something that is very evocative about that. So
it is. After the war, for a time, it was empty, off and on, in the second half of the 20th century. There's one, to me, very interesting story of a young boy who lived in that neighborhood in the 1960s, who grew up playing, quote unquote, with the children in the basement, and would crawl into the basement through an open window and spend hours playing, quote unquote, with the children. And the building was abandoned. There were no children in the building.
Yeah, and I don't believe that the Pythians reoccupied it after World War II, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that right?
That is my understanding as well.
Yeah. So basically, pretty much off and on, it was empty after the war. I know ultimately the city owned it, and in the 90s they put it up for sale because they viewed it as a white elephant. And I actually considered putting in a bid on it, and then chickened out because I didn't have a whole lot of money. And one person bid, and he bid $4,000, and so he got Pythian Castle for $4,000.
Wow.
And it was rough in some places. He renovated enough rooms to live in, and lived in it for several years, and then sold it to the current owner for a substantial six-figure amount.
Well, and it's difficult for those of us who are, okay, so I find this interesting. On one level, we're used to large, cavernous box store, department building type structures, huge strip malls, huge mall-like structures, giant Walmart supercenters, that sort of thing. But these are large disposable boxes.
Yeah.
They are structures that are meant to be taken down as easily, if not more easily, than they're put up. They are not, these buildings are not representations of craftsmanship. These buildings are not meant to last generation after generation after generation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think intuitively we understand and we recognize that, and just simply the existence of large space does not typically impress us at this point. We don't walk into a Walmart supercenter and gasp in amazement that this many acres is, under steel girders. We're just like, fine, where's the bread? Or whatever. But the juxtaposition with structures like the Pythian Castle, including the Pythian Castle, these structures that are truly massive structures, but they are meant to last forever. They were built with extraordinary artisanship inside and out. We're dealing with these beautifully hewn blocks of Carthage limestone. We're dealing with incredibly ornate woodworking, hardwood motifs throughout there. It is just, the entire building is this massive and admittedly expensive to maintain work of art.
Yes. And for that, I have to hand it to the current owner. You've done a good job.
Yes, it is, and it is beautiful. It was one of the things that was really notable to me, was how beautiful it was, with just going through the tour. And so I do recommend, I think we do both recommend, if you get a chance to see the Pythian Castle, you should do so. Not just at Halloween, although it's fun at Halloween, but really anytime that you can.
Definitely. And there are accounts of activity to this day, and it has been the subject of some of the reality shows.
Yes.
Probably most notably The Haunted Collector, and my understanding is that they decided that a particular sword was a focal point of activity there, and it was removed, and the show stated that the owner later confirmed that activity had subsided, and I do know it affected their ticket sales for a while, but that seems to have been resolved.
Yes. Now, my guess, and I've not seen that particular episode. My guess is that the sword was believed to belong to one of the knights or someone associated with the castle.
I believe so. Yes, if I recall correctly, and I've seen the episode, and it in sequence. It was the episode that was after an episode that I actually was on that show, but I do believe it was one of the knight's swords.
Now, something that is interesting, and we don't seem to have a lot of details of number of deaths in the castle, etc.
Right.
That said, it was a retirement home and an orphanage.
Yeah, I'm sure there were a number, but I'm not sure how those records were kept, and I'm not sure where burials were made, if they were paupers' graves, or if I imagine the Pythians provided for burials as well, but I don't know.
That would be my guess. It would be interesting to dig into it. Presumably they would have been buried in one of Springfield's cemeteries.
I would assume so, but I've never really heard any details on that either. So I think you had a lot of people go through that space in that time period, and then you had then you had all that activity during the war, which some of it was very pleasant, very, positive, happy energy, or at least anticipatory with USO, etc. And then you had energy while it was basically a prison camp that could range from sadness to anger, etc. So it would not surprise me if there isn't some sort of energy there.
I agree. There have been so many people within that space at so many different transitional points of life and death.
Exactly. And then, I can't discount the narrative from the 60s of playing with kids in the basement. And there may well have been some of the children that passed while they were there, but I don't know.
Very true. And again, I think it stands to reason over the course of decades that these things occurred. But unfortunately, the details may be very difficult to obtain. The details may simply have been lost. And
that's true. But who knows how much energy is retained in that Carthage marble?
Yes. Oh, so when you get a chance to go check it out for yourself. And again, I think so many of these points, and we talk about this on the tours, but this type of tour, this type of tourism, I think in the long run is extraordinary because it's helping to preserve so many incredibly important locations.
And giving people context to their local history.
It does. It really does. So I love the place.
I do too. And since, architecture is sort of a focal point with it, maybe we should just kind of delve a little bit into downtown tunnels and an infamous case that the area that has a tie to it.
Absolutely. So, of course, spoiler alert, vampires in Springfield.
And that it's interesting that it's such a persistent subject, and it predates the crime it's associated with, which of course is the Feeney murders.
It predates it by a lot, and in different ways and different times. The first thing that may have given rise to this, whether it's an urban legend or old lore or certain people doing certain things that other people don't know about and we just aren't sure, is that the area that Springfield, the downtown Springfield area is built upon was originally a location with lots and lots of springs and creeks. And in order to develop the metro, you can't just get rid of water. You can't just snap your fingers and have water not be there. And
very true.
And I think it is a little ironic in this regard, because those fresh water sources would have been a primary reason to settle Springfield in the early days. And then as modern or urban water management and clean water facilities, et cetera, become a thing, and as Springfield's population grows, that same water that helped found the city becomes a bit of a problem. What do we do with growing the city? And the result is a very extensive drainage tunnel system that exists out of sight. Now, of course, cities, any city has a drainage grid network, but we're dealing with very extensive, in some cases, old creek beds, in some cases, cavern networks, and then several, structured layers of drainage tunnels with a modern city built over the top of it, so that you can't see any of that unless you know to look.
Right.
Those locations have become refuge spots for a variety of populations, including the indigent population of Springfield at various times, all the way up to the current day, and a gathering places for a wide variety of people for a wide variety of reasons.
Exactly. And the initial vampire lore around Springfield isn't even connected to the tunnels. So there's that too.
Yes. And what do we have on documentation for the pre-tunnel lore? My understanding is at least a couple of accounts of frightening people doing scary things at the turn of the century from positions of a potential authority.
That's basically what I found too, is just a couple of anecdotal stories that seem to be indicative of some sort of bloodlust activity, and the stories being that there's a group of vampires, or what we would say is lifestyle now,
Yes.
And so, but all of that predates the sort of the pop culture and the larger movement of this subculture that really came about out of the late 70s and 80s into the 90s.
Thank you, Anne Rice.
Yes. And it just seems to be an odd place that you would have these anecdotal stories in Springfield, Missouri versus, I don't know, New Orleans or someplace like that, where you have more of this sort of subculture anyway. So I find that curious, but
I do too.
But with the tunnels, it really is more connected to particularly the 90s, and it was brought to the attention of a lot of people through coverage of the Feeney murder trial in the mid 90s, because John Feeney, who was accused of killing his wife and children, it came out, was involved in playing the Vampire the Masquerade, and almost cosplay LARPing kind of activity, and but it ended up being tied in all of that to a lot of tales of a vampire cult that would meet in the tunnels under downtown.
And there's a lot of moving parts. My understanding is, what's the status of this case?
Of the Feeney murders, that he was acquitted, and technically the case is unsolved at this point.
Correct. I need to check on my ghost hunting dog. He's making strange noise.
Okay.
But it'll just take me just a second. If you don't mind going over, just familiarizing folks with the initial details of the case, and I'll be back in a second.
Okay. Basically, the case came about in February of 1995. The family was at home, except for the father, John, who he was a teacher, and he was at a conference for work at the Lake of the Ozarks. And there were 2 children, an infant and or a toddler, and Jennifer, 6-year-old boy Tyler, and then Cheryl Feeney, who was the mother. And they were found dead, the baby being strangled, and Tyler and his mother being bludgeoned and by a pipe. And the case ended up focusing on John with the theory that he had come back from the conference, committed the crime, and then went back by the next morning to be at the conference as a means of an alibi. And there was circumstantial evidence that made people think that maybe he had a motive. He had increased his life insurance in the months before on his wife for $250,000, taking out an additional $250,000 insurance on her life. There was a witness at a nearby gas station who said that he had sold gas to a man resembling John Feeney in the early morning hours after the murders, and he recognized the car, which was a red Mustang convertible. However, it was later found that he wasn't working on that day, so he must have been thinking of another day, was sort of the conclusion. I think people wondered about this because he continued to live in the home that his entire family was murdered in over the course of a little over a year between it happening and the trial. And I remember at the time, a lot of people were just like, they couldn't believe, how could someone do that? But ultimately, they could not find the smoking gun, and he was acquitted. But sort of the conspiracy theory or urban legend aspects of all this really built up around this idea of a vampire cult. And at various times, there's been people will say there's a church that meets down there and it's a satanic church or a quote hell church or whatever. Now, I do know someone personally who had an experience down there. You will find, if you start looking at this on the internet, that people will say, I've never heard of this, and there's nothing like this going on. It didn't go on, before, and it's not going on now. Now, I can tell you, when I was in college, there were tales of groups meeting down there and weird things happening, not necessarily vampires, but certainly that there was something going on. That those were rumors, and this predates the Feeney trial. The situation that I'm aware of was someone having a personal experience exploring the tunnels and coming upon a chair in the middle of one of the tunnels with someone sitting in it and hearing what sounds like chanting or singing, etc., further down, and being chased out of the tunnel, is a number of years after the Feeney trial, more than probably 15 years afterwards. So you're talking about things that predate this as well as much afterwards. So I think it's hard to say there's absolutely nothing to it. I think it did get sensationalized during this trial.
Agreed. And it's obviously the acquittal is on public record.
Yes.
And I think that's very important to note. There's as you've already noted, there's some very interesting message threads out there in regards to this topic, and some of those threads can get very very dark and very combative quickly.
Yeah.
And they're from a sociological standpoint, it is of course interesting to note, because on the surface it could easily be one of these situations where, oh my goodness, somebody's playing Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is of the devil, and here we go. And this is, 80s and 90s culture that doesn't look at role-playing games and post Tolkien culture and gaming the same way that it does now. And
I think that's very accurate, particularly video gaming. I think that aspect of pop culture has changed our views on role playing and cosplay so much that I think that what was brought out in the trial is basically, he had played Magic the Gathering and had played role-playing games, but I mean, there was even evidence that he's.
I lost it.
Oh.
So when you wrap up, you have to.
Okay. We have a little production issue here.
Okay.
But I think if the same sort of set of facts were presented today, it would not have the same effect.
Right. I think that there's certainly a bulwark, and I would say an appropriate one, built sociologically, that doing these things is not, oh my goodness, that's super weird, that's super strange, what are you doing? And it's much more difficult to build rumors or jump to conclusions around someone who does this sort of thing, because so many people do, and obviously harmlessly and for a lot of positive reasons. I know a ton of people who play D&D. I don't myself, but I also do cosplay and wear antlers to events, so I'm right in there with the rest of y'all, quote unquote. But I think that whether or not this case actually had any connection to the strange things happening in the tunnels, it did resonate or strike a nerve with a number of people who had either heard of these things happening or had first person experience or immediate knowledge of things happening down there.
I think so. And then it very well, it startled people who had no information about that.
Yes.
And so, it just seemed like it was that perfect storm of the time that it happened and the set of information to create this whirlwind of supposition that even today seems to get darker and darker on some of these message boards.
It does.
This far
really
out.
Yeah, very much so. So it is a fascinating aspect of Springfield culture, sort of the underground of Springfield culture, literally and figuratively. And some of those mysteries are very much still unsolved. And
speaking of unsolved mysteries, probably the biggest one in Springfield, of course, is the 3 missing women.
Yes, it
Stacey McCall, Susie Streeter, and Cheryl Lovett. And it's, an unsolved case as well, and with more questions than answers. And it's one that startled the community, not because of these, details, like in the Feeney case, that seem to be just over the top and different from everyday goings on. But in this situation, for the lack of details of what happened.
Right. We have a still unexplained disappearance.
Yes. And from a moment in time that everyone experiences, pretty much. You're talking about two girls, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall, graduating from high school, ending up at Susie's house that night. They initially were going to spend the night with another friend and then all go to Branson the next morning.
Mm.
And their friend's house, there was a number of people there visiting, and so they decided to go to Susie's house. And Stacy McCall called her mother and told her that they were going over to Susie's and they would leave in the morning then. And they know they got there, they each drove their cars over there. They were at the house. Looks like they did go to bed because it looked as if the girls had slept in Susie's bed. And the friend that they were going to go to Branson with starts calling in the morning. They get no answer. And so after 2 or 3 hours, she and her boyfriend go over and they find broken glass on the porch. The porch light had been busted out. And they're not really thinking of crime scene. And again, I think you have to, Springfield at that point was not used to a lot of kidnappings and kidnappings or murders, that kind of thing. They clean up the mess on the porch. They go through the house. It just looks like they walked out. Their purses are there. Their shoes are there. Susie and her mother both smoked and their cigarettes were sitting there. And through the course of the day, a number of people come in and out. And finally, Stacy McCall's mother's getting concerned because Stacy usually would check in with her. And so she ends up calling this third friend's house. The sister tells them that they're trying to find them, and she goes over to Cheryl Lovett's house. And even then, she said there were about 10 people in the house, and they even wait a while longer before they call the police because they just weren't thinking of something like this.
Yes.
And unfortunately, all of that may have contaminated crime scene in a way that may have made this case more difficult.
Agreed. And it's so tragic and unfortunate all the way around. And it is still an unsolved case. There are still individuals who are working on this case.
Yes.
And this took place on June 6th, 1992. It is absolutely heartbreaking in regards to the families and friends associated with this. And it had a huge impact on the city of Springfield.
It did. And I think as someone who was there at the time, it just, and, I'd lived in St. Louis and so forth, and, crime was not something that I was, unaware of by any means. And you had to no, no clue as to what happened. At one point, Cheryl Levitt's son, Bart, was a suspect, but they cleared him. Years later, he got into criminal problems, I think, in Texas, and I believe also in Colorado. And I know I've read reports that he had been arrested on suspicion of domestic violence, but years and years later. And I've seen people say, well, then, maybe he did it. And it's like, that's a huge leap of faith, of logic rather, to assume that. And of course, they never have linked him in any way to it. Although apparently he'd had an argument with his mother or something. But that's not certainly too out of the ordinary anyway. Over time, there's been a lot of speculation of whether Robert Cox was involved, and mainly from his own statements. He was he'd been released from prison in Florida, and he later was, and he was convicted of killing a woman in Florida, but he was out of prison. He was in the Springfield area at the time of the disappearances. He ended up in prison in Texas on another matter, and he made statements saying he came to light because basically while he was in prison in Texas, he made statements saying he knew they were dead.
Yes. Which is chilling.
It was investigated. I think it was KY3 actually went down and interviewed him, Dennis Graves. And he was rather evasive, and very vague. His statement was, I know that they're dead, I'll say that, and I know that. And Graves asked him, that's not a theory? And he said, I just know that they're dead. That's not my theory. I just know that. There's no doubt about it. But he never gave any details.
Yes.
Or anything to follow up on. So it's hard to know. It's hard to know whether or not there was something there. I know there's been, search warrants and investigations on property in Webster County, in Berry County, and I think another location at some point. The Berry County site actually seemed to possibly have found something, but they couldn't tie it to the case specifically. There was blood evidence, but they couldn't tie it to the case specifically. And there was green metal. There had been an account of someone seeing a green van in the area, and possibly Susie Streeter driving it, supposedly the morning that they disappeared. And there was green metal found at this site, but they couldn't prove whether or not it was a van or not.
Right.
So
every time that one of these leads happens, it ultimately leads to something that's either inconclusive or it just becomes a disproven end.
Yeah. And and I think that's one of the things. Sometimes we end up in a situation that we are living with literally no answers.
Yes.
At least at this point. There's been various theories, conjectures over the years, as and you'll find them if you look on the internet, as to perhaps this convicted murderer was involved, or perhaps this group, or maybe it was about this or that, but there really has never been evidence to tie, and particularly anything that's been made public.
Correct. So I think first of all, our hearts go out and to everyone who's been personally affected by this case. You were living in Springfield at the time. What do you feel was the fallout or the result of this case for folks of Springfield moving forward?
There was a lot of loss of innocence, that sense of those things don't happen here. That, there is no immunity to randomness. And I think that's probably what affected people the most, is the sense of being random.
Yes.
Um,
and that just the unknowing, the not knowing elements do terrible things to the human psyche.
yes. And I think in some ways it was, we've talked about in other episodes about the time period of the Cold War affecting people, having that, that sense just kind of hanging out there that you have no control. I think in a microcosm, that's what was happening in Springfield, is that sense of looming danger, but no control or way to know that the danger's there, so to speak.
Yes. And I think obviously we can't speak to this case specifically, but you have a really interesting background in interacting with individuals who have been victims of a variety of very negative experiences.
Yeah.
What just in terms of potentially warning people against this type of crime, this type of violence, what would you tell people to do just to make themselves less exploitable?
Well, be aware of your surroundings. I think one thing that in this particular case that I think kind of dug into the psyche of Springfield was the sense of, was it someone they trusted, because there seemed to be no struggle other than the porch light being broken. And you have to not look at the world with rose-colored glasses, so to speak, including sometimes people around you. What we do know is that the girls were going over there at 2 a.m. That's when Stacy called her mother. So it happened after that and before the friend called at like 8 a.m.
Yes.
So you are talking about something that had to happen very late at night or very early in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And so be aware. And if you have to have that sense of self-preservation, that if something's off, act like it.
Correct. Correct. And at the end of the day, better safe than sorry.
Exactly. And whether or not this involves someone they knew, who knows. But I've seen a lot of people over time in my career as an attorney. They got themselves in trouble by being overly trusting and assuming that what they would view suspicious if it was happening in the neighbor's house isn't that way because it's them. and they're alive.
Correct. So it is a difficult and is a dark subject.
It is. And we do encourage people not to just speculate. Rumors don't help. They often stir up. And I recently had a situation where basically innuendo told to one person, told to someone else, someone to say, oh, this, it must be a clue to something, and I'm going to let's turn it into the police. If you have information, do that. But if it's just conjecture based on no information other than gossip or rumor, what often happens is they're checking out leads that go nowhere. In this case, it's had over 20,000 leads.
Correct. And unfortunately, once things move into that incredibly public sphere, those types of things begin to happen.
They do. And of course, everyone would like answers.
Yes.
But they need to be grounded in fact.
They do. So utilize critical thinking skills and the use of objective data. And at that point, if you do somehow have information at this point, please contact law enforcement.
Yes, certainly do so. That might be a good place to end tonight. We do ask everyone to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on the next episode, we're going to be discussing Dark Winter Tales and Old Christmas right here in the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Thank you to everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.